Hey everybody. Last section here for chapter 8, section 8.4, homeostasis in cells. And lucky for you, this is a very short section today. This should just take hopefully a lot fewer in terms of the amount of time. It's going to take a lot fewer minutes here for this one. So go ahead and put down the heading for me, section 8.4, homeostasis and cells, and then we'll move on from there. Okay. So when we look at the objectives for this last section, we have two. So explain how single-celled organisms maintain homeostasis, and then describe how cells of a multicellular organism work together to maintain homeostasis. So both of these involve this concept, again, of homeostasis. And if you forgot what that means, that is, again, the maintenance of constant internal conditions. So that would be something certainly to jot down if that was something that you've forgotten since we first covered it in chapter 1. But that would be like our body's ability to maintain consistent body temperatures and pH and heart rate and oxygen levels and so on and so forth. So all living things need to have the ability to maintain that homeostasis. And it's going to look a little bit different if you're single-celled and are prokaryotic, or even single-celled eukaryotes, versus if you're multicellular and larger and more complex, as most animals and humans especially are. Okay. So looking at single-celled organisms first, remember these are called unicellular organisms, uni meaning one or single. So when we look at homeostasis, again, we are talking about for a unicellular organism, they need to be able to kind of do all these things just within this one cell. And if you think about the difference between these different processes, like the complexity there, these guys are pretty, well suited to what they do, because somehow they're able to kind of capture and do all of this even within such a confined single cellular space. So unicellular organisms, as with all living things, have to grow. They need to respond to their environment. They need to have a metabolism where they're taking energy and they're converting it into something that's usable so that they can do things like grow and respond. For some of them that are photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, they have to be able to produce their own energy even within that small single-celled space. In addition, with growth, we always talk about production of new cells. And so reproduction is also part of their homeostasis mechanisms. So all of these things are kind of held within the cytoplasm. Remember, there aren't organelles to help them with this. All of these enzymes and chemical reactions would kind of be happening right around and near each other. The only thing that we can say is certainly defined and that would be happening in one location would be that protein synthesis that's done by our ribosomes. So the making of proteins, the creating of proteins with the help of those ribosomes that are not membrane bound. Okay. So again, these guys are generally very simple, but again, the fact that all these things are happening points to really the fact that there are some complex things that have to be happening there. Multicellular organisms, on the other hand, obviously very complicated. We have many different cell types. If we talk about humans specifically, we have cell types like what you're seeing here at the bottom. And by the way, yes, I would write all of what you see on this slide here, especially this is a short section, so we might as well just jot down what's there. So the cell types you're looking at down here at the bottom, the ones on the left here are skin cells. And I'll jot some of these down here so we can talk about them. So skin cells are there. These are bone cells here in the middle. And these are cells of our intestines here on the right. So when we look at the structure and the shape of these, right, these could all actually be of the same individual, but notice how different they look. And the way that occurs is through a really complicated process that we call cellular differentiation. And this is a process where, cells become kind of uniquely specialized for whatever their role may be in the body. So within our bodies, we have different cell types, right? And those cell types interact to form things like organs, and then all those things interact. And we'll see that here on the next slide. But it's important in complex living things that are multicellular that specific areas of the body are specialized for specific jobs. Like there's a reason why we're created in this way, and there's a reason why our bodies are organized in systems like they are. So this process again is called cellular differentiation, and how that occurs is based on sets of proteins that are expressed through reading our DNA when we're first developing, like when we're still at this very, very small stage in the womb where our cells are first dividing. Different proteins are turned on and off, and that leads to the formation of cells that have unique shapes and unique jobs. So what ends up happening, the cells that you're looking at down here, a skin cell, for example, its job looks very different than a bone cell. The skin's job is to protect, right? That's why they're shaped kind of like shingles on a house, because it's real easy to just kind of like brush them off if you suffer an injury or if they die and are damaged. Bone cells, on the other hand, are supposed to provide structural support, but we also know that they're very hollow. You can see the interior of those bone cells in the picture. It's a bunch of like gaping holes. And that's to allow us to actually be able to move around. If our bones were completely filled up and they were very dense, our bones would be too heavy for our muscles to be able to kind of move into any direction. And so the fact that they're hollow makes it really relates to our ability to move around as well as we do. Intestines, obviously, their job is to help digest food, right? So the shapes of these really point to what their functions are. And all of that comes back to, what are we expressing in our cells? What genes are being expressed? How are we reading our DNA, and how are we making these proteins? So a skin cell is gonna show different proteins and have different proteins in it than a bone cell will. And then those will both differ from what's in an intestinal cell. So again, these cell types, as unique as they are, that comes from this process, again, of cellular differentiation, this term you see right here, okay? When we look at these different types, right, I mentioned that we have a whole lot going on in multicellular organisms. And if we're looking at cells specifically, as I mentioned, cells together can interact to create whole organs, and those organs can together interact to create organ systems. This piece down here, I would certainly make sure you have jotted down somewhere, okay? Because when we talk about cells and multicellular organisms, this would be important to keep in mind. So we can have different cell types that together make up a tissue, that when we group those tissues together make up an organ and then an organ system. So the example here is the nervous system, which is mostly comprised of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves that are running from places like your brain and your spinal cord down to the ends of your fingers and toes and the rest of your body. So we have neurons. That's one cell type that makes up this nervous system. Together, those neurons group and become nerve tissue. And then we have brain as one of the organs. Again, spinal cord would be another. And then we have a nervous system. If you talk about the musculoskeletal system, that would include all of the bones, the muscles, the ligaments, the tendons that all interact as part of that system also. So obviously the shape, structure, and function of those are all going to be slightly different, right? Muscles and bones do two different things. You could look at the digestive system, right? That would include things like the esophagus and the mouth, all the way down to the stomach, intestines, colon, gallbladder, pancreas. Like there's all sorts of different organs and tissue types that interact for that. Okay, so we can go on and on about organ systems, but again, the bottom line here is within a multicellular organism, we create these different cells through differentiation. They together function as part of a tissue, which together functions as part of an organ, which all taken together makes an organ system. Okay. Complicated sometimes. So cell communication here, this is actually my very last slide. So with cellular communication, when we talk about larger complex organisms like humans that have multiple body systems, it's important that cells of a related tissue or organ, or even an unrelated tissue or organ, have the ability to communicate with one another, just like we kind of are communicating with each other when we speak to one another. So cell signals are transferred into cells through things that we call receptors. Receptors receive signals. They receive chemical signals. And the chemical signal that we're referring to here is this thing right here. It's called a ligand. That's how you say that word, ligand. So a ligand can be any type of molecule. If we're looking at something like the musculoskeletal system, we know that there are certain hormones and steroids that can lead to excess growth of those things, right? Like human growth hormone is one example of a naturally occurring hormone that we know is now used as a steroid that can lead to more growth, more cell division on the part of the bones and the muscles. So what would happen in that scenario? You would have receptors sitting on the cells of your muscles and the cells that make up your bones and your ligaments and your tendons. And when that growth hormone is kind of floating through the body, it can bind to those receptors, interact with those receptors, be absorbed by the cell, and cause the cell to make a change. In the case of growth hormone, that change is going to look like more cell division, larger growth over a shorter period of time, right? It's going to stimulate that process. So receptors' jobs are to help obtain signals from the extracellular space, all the stuff around a cell on the outside, and then do something with those signals. So there are two different types of receptors. There are what we call membrane receptors, and then there are intracellular receptors. And if you remember, intra was a Latin root, and we talked about it again in ecology, and I think we talked about it again a little bit with properties of water and hydrogen bonds. Intra here means within. So these are going to be intracellular receptors are going to be receptors that we find inside of the cell. Okay, these are things that don't ever leave the cell. They float in the cytoplasm, and if there's a signal that needs to come in and bind with them, it's a signal that can cross the membrane on its own. Okay, so in that case, we're talking about nonpolar, hydrophobic, uncharged, and small. And there are certainly examples of that. But a lot of the ligands, a lot of the cell signaling we see is done actually by things like ions, or like I mentioned, hormones. And we know that those things, ions especially, are charged and polar, and they don't readily cross the membrane. So they would certainly be interacting with these membrane receptors right here, okay? So what we're looking at here in this picture, you have several different places where you would have membrane receptors that allow for communication between different cells in this piece of tissue here, okay? So again, main difference is location. Membrane receptors found in the membrane. Intracellular receptors are found in the cytoplasm, both of which their job is to bind to a ligand and then lead to a change in the cell. They move that signal somewhere else. They tell the nucleus to do something in response, and then the cell adapts and changes its behavior. Okay. All right. So that is the end of chapter 2. That is the end of section 2.4. Sorry, not 2. This is the end of chapter 8, the end of section 8.4. If you have questions for me about any of this, as always, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.